Hi there, everyone. Wanted to get on to tell you this story of the publishing deal that I turned down. And really, my purpose of wanting to share this story with you is to give you maybe a list of things to think about when you are trying to choose whether you want to traditionally publish or self publish. So I know that for a lot of people, the world of traditional publishing is kind of mystifying. So I wanted to break down what it might be like if you do have a publisher approach you or if you have a proposal that gets accepted. Again, sort of the things that you should think about and maybe give you some food for thought about whether you should traditionally publish or self-publish. But first, I'll quick introduce myself. Hi, I'm Dr. Beth Brownbows of Blogger to Author. I'm a #1 Amazon best-selling author. I have 4 books out in print now, and I am really passionate about helping my fellow bloggers and content creators and making it easy for them to take their content and turn it into a self-published book that they can then use to really build a lot of authority and credibility, set themselves apart as a thought leader, and then of course make a little bit of extra income with royalties as well. But back to my book and the essentially the approach that I had from a publisher. So I self-published my book, Yoga for Runners, my first book, back in the fall of 2015, and it did well for me. It helped me do a lot of great things like build my blog a little bit more, build my credibility. Definitely I did that pretty much instantaneously. I'd been blogging on the subject for a while, but when I really wanted to solidify myself as an expert on that topic, the book absolutely helped me do that. And then of course I was selling books too. The books helped me sell my course, which is at a higher price point, helped me make more money. So essentially I had this book, Yoga for Runners, that was doing well and that a lot of especially my audience was really enjoying. I was getting great feedback about it, etc., etc. So it was not quite a year after I had published it that I was approached by a small publishing house. So definitely not in the big 5, maybe not in the top 100 of publishers, but still a publishing house, and they wanted to buy the rights to my book. And so I was intrigued. I asked, essentially the first email, if I remember it correctly, was just wondering if I would be even interested in selling the rights. And I said, well, sure, I will see what you have to say. And so I was, I kind of corresponded back and forth with the editor who was interested in working with me on that. And I eventually got a contract and was looking at it very closely. And just there were some things in there that I looked at. I crunched some numbers and ultimately decided to stay self-published. I do believe it was the right decision for me at the time. I'm not saying that I will never ever work with a traditional publisher. I would never say that. I would never tell you that you should never work with a traditional publisher. What I do think you should do is really carefully weigh the pros and cons of self-publishing versus traditionally publishing and see if it is better for you, or really make the choice for you, what's best for you and your goals. And I guess a little caveat to this story is that, even if you self-publish, that doesn't mean that book will never be traditionally published. If it does well, a traditional publisher may want to come and snatch it up for you. And I've heard many stories of this happening to bloggers, definitely, and other writers as well. So that also can happen. But with that said, so what were the reasons, or what were the things that made me turn the book deal down? Well, are just things that you should consider as well. First and foremost would be the advance. because it was a small publishing house, they weren't going to pay me a ton of money. Granted, back then I wasn't making as much, and so it wouldn't have been such a big deal for me to take the amount of money that they offered. But I do think that when you are deciding whether or not to take a book deal, you need to look at that advance and really factor in how much time you would need to put into either completely creating the book from scratch or from whatever you've got in terms of content, if you can repurpose from your blog, that sort of thing. And that's something, just a little bit of an aside, you should look at with the contract. And sometimes the contract will include like exclusivity. And so that's something that I had to ask about. Like, hey, by the way, the first drafts of a lot of the chapters, or half a chapter, that sort of thing actually came from my blog post. Does that mean I'm going to have to take my blog posts down, or can they stay up because they were published first? It turns out that those would have been able to stay up, but that's something that you should absolutely ask the publisher about, and make sure you're very clear about. And this is where you might even think about, if this is something you really want to do, you might have a lawyer look over the contract for you as well. So that was something that kind of stuck out at me. The advance that I was offered wasn't bad, and especially for, again, the point that I was at in my business, but really consider, is the advance that they're going to give you enough to offset the time that you would have to take away to write the book? And then also keep in mind that you may need to pay for the production of certain elements of the book from that advance, and that's something that you should discuss with your editor at the publisher, or that you should look for in the contract. So, for example, I devoured the podcast, The Cookbook Deal, created by Jessica Mernan. It was all about the creation of her cookbook, One Part Plant. And one interesting thing I thought she brought up, and not being I would not identify as a food blogger, so I didn't really know this about the production of cookbooks with traditional publishers, but she was expected to pay for all the food photography for her book, and she actually wound up hiring a food stylist and a prop stylist too for all of her food photos. Now, they turned out beautifully, but those were expenses that she was not expecting to have because she didn't necessarily know the ins and outs of the advance. So that's just something that you should think about, and really get in touch with your editor as well, or even a book agent if you're working with a book agent. And in most cases, if a publisher is not soliciting you, and even if a publisher is soliciting you, you might want to get a book agent anyway, because they might be able to do some negotiating on your behalf. They will take a chunk of your royalties, though, so something to keep in mind. But speaking of royalties, that's something that you should absolutely look at. So across the board, if you're self-publishing, you're going to make more money per book, hands down. Just because, for example, most people these days are publishing through CreateSpace, but even if you're using some other print-on-demand service, you are going to keep a larger percentage of the sale price of that book. Amazon will take a chunk, CreateSpace will take a chunk, that sort of thing. But your chunk is going to be higher self-publishing in just about every case than it will be for traditionally publishing. The offer that I got from the traditional publisher, they only offered me, I think it was 5% of the essentially the cost or the sale price of ebooks and paperback books, and I think it was 10% of hardcovers. So that's not a lot of money. And really what I had to do is sit there and think long and hard, and even just use some examples of how much I would be making with them. Granted, the list price would be higher on the book than what I currently charge, that sort of thing, but it still was going to be a big reduction in the number or the amount of money I was making per book. And so I had to sit down and think hard about whether or not the fact that it would be traditionally published, and it would offset that, and keeping in mind to the amount of marketing that they would put in. And so for this particular publisher, the marketing that they would do came down to really organizing some interviews over the day or two surrounding the launch. Most of those were going to be online interviews, so podcast interviews or phone interviews with potential media outlets. And there wasn't necessarily any guarantee of interviews to begin with, but really what they needed me to do was to set aside like 2 days in my schedule where I could do interviews if there was any media interest. And a lot of publishers will sit down and their resources that they have to put into publicity are limited. And so they'll take the books that they think are going to do the best and they'll put the most resources behind those books. So, and again, this is something that you would want to negotiate or just make sure that you get filled in on, and your book agent can absolutely help you out with that. You can look at the contract that they offer you. Every contract is going to be different. So again, you might want to have a lawyer look over that. But really figure out, okay, are they guaranteeing you a certain amount of press, or can that change? How much press are you going to be expected to do on your own? How much attention are you going to be expected to do, or are you expected to garner on your own? And just publicity in general, how much legwork are you expected to be doing? How much will they do? Because the publicity has a huge impact, especially around the launch, on how well your book does overall. So I know a lot of people, they just think that if they work with a traditional publisher, the traditional publisher is going to be able to secure them all of this press and it's going to explode from there. That's not necessarily the case. And again, I mentioned that podcast, The Cookbook Deal by Jessica Murnan. Go listen to it, because I think also she has a really interesting take and story on what happened with her and the press that her publisher was able to get versus the impact of what she did to promote her book in terms of, reaching out to people she had relationships with, that sort of thing. So that can have a huge impact. And I think it's something that people should consider. So what happened with my book? Obviously my book is still published. So I looked at the full package, everything that I was expected to do, the fact that I was turning creative control of my baby over to somebody else. And then, the money did play part of it too. I'll be completely honest. And I decided that, for that particular deal with that particular publisher, it was not the best decision for me at that point. Again, I'm not saying that I would never traditionally publish. I'm not saying that you should never traditionally publish, but I guess I just wanted to share this story with you so that you might have an example of what it's like to even look at a deal with a traditional publisher, and so that you can think through really whether or not going after that traditional deal is what you want to do if you are trying to decide whether or not you want to traditionally publish or self-publish. So for those of you real quick who are thinking about traditional publishing, what you want to do is find a book agent, and then from there create a book proposal that will get sent out, and your agent can help you create a proposal. But really, for just about every publisher out there, there are very few that accept unsolicited proposals. The vast majority of them are going to require that you go through an agent, and that agent just kind of acts as a gatekeeper. So how do you find an agent? I'm sorry, I'm struggling for words today. Ask your fellow bloggers or people in the same space who they used as an agent if they had one. You could ask if their agent is taking on new clients. If they don't feel like you're a good fit, they may not feel comfortable giving out that information. Just accept that that might be the case. Also, there are big lists of agents that you can look through, and the big one that most people think about, Writer's Digest every year puts together a big guide to literary agents. And so you could look in there, and then it comes down to finding the right agent for your book and your niche. And so really look to find an agent who's the right fit for you. So for example, if you are a vegan food blogger, you probably don't want to find an agent who specializes in meat-based grilling books, for example. You want to find somebody who is experienced with cookbooks, for example, in, more health niches or vegetarian and vegan niches. So find that agent who has experience with the type of book that you're trying to publish and go from there. And don't necessarily expect that if you've been blogging for a while that a publisher is going to approach you and want to publish your book, or that if you have a self-published book, don't assume that a publisher is going to come across and want to buy your book or buy the rights to your book. That's not necessarily the case. So just keep that in mind. So I hope that this story has helped you, given you at least some food for thought, and helped you maybe understand what it might be like to work with a publisher, whether or not they approach you, or whether or not you need to approach them, again, through an agent and with a book proposal. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And until next time, happy writing.